Hello, I'm your host, Giselle Gamby, and this is the Intuitive Pull podcast. First of all, I want to say thank you to the community of listeners because there have been breathtaking ripples that have occurred from listening to this podcast, and I'm excited to be witness of many, many more. This year, I'm dedicating this podcast to the theme of 2023 being a breakthrough year. No matter how successful, fulfilled, and happy we are, and the truth is that sometimes we're not, we all have thresholds we've placed on ourselves on how loving and powerful we've allowed ourselves to be. Following the intuitive pull does not negate our vulnerabilities and our humanness. Oftentimes, following the intuitive pull asks us to see our blind spots and to bring what has been in the shadow to light. And when we do, we can see that being fully human is in fact the precursor to remembering that we are infinitely greater than this mortal body, that we are infinitely connected beyond this time and space, not in spite of our humanity, but because of the intricate weaving of all aspects of our precious humanity. When we take responsibility and remember that you have the power to decide what you choose, and we fuse that with a letting go of control and surrendering into the plans that you didn't make, there is nothing that you cannot transform. My wish is that you see that the deeper you go, the greater your wealth in all ways, and that authenticity is always profitable. Have fun! Hello, Intuitive Pull community. It is the day before I head to Kenya for my 4th retreat there, and I'm very excited. And I'm really excited to be sharing this episode with you. This episode is Heidi Todd's story so far. Heidi was coaching in the Catalyst group with me last year, and I had the intuition to ask her to write her story out and to share it on a group call that we have every week on Fridays. And so she did. And it was absolutely spectacular. And Heidi was surprised because Heidi's definition of her story is one of it being very ordinary. And yet, in the ordinariness of it is the extraordinariness. And then I was pulled once again to ask Heidi if she would actually record her story for me to share it on this podcast. And I have just listened to it once again, and I have the biggest smile on my face, truthfully, the biggest smile on my face. Heidi will define her story as ordinary, and yet it is nothing but the depth of love and self-worth that is here on the other side of Heidi's dark night of the soul, and her self-value that sees what her greatness is phenomenal. I love how Heidi completes the sharing of her story in that she shares her intention that may something extraordinary be brought out of the ordinary. I know in the depths of my bones, I know in my solar plexus and in my heart, those energies are going off right now, that this story will absolutely resonate, connect, and may even lovingly provoke some of the listeners here. And should that be the case, I highly, highly encourage you to follow whatever intuitive pulls are here. Heidi's details and her program, Panning for Gold, will be in the show notes. And if you are pulled to connect with Heidi for any other reason that you have been moved by outside of Panning for Gold, I highly, highly encourage you to connect with Heidi. She is an extremely powerful woman in her ability to see the unseen and to hear the unheard, what has been unspoken, to make connections and to reflect back. I've had Heidi on group calls and retreats in the past. In fact, Heidi came to Kenya with me in November last year. And in my experience, she is an incredible asset to have for her ability to make connections and to draw conclusions that we would not be able to receive had it not been for Heidi's seeing, intuitive seeing. Enjoy this episode.
When Giselle asked me to share my story, it felt deeply uncomfortable. My life is so ordinary. It's the life lived by so many women of my generation. And as a result, maybe I can see that my story represents a great swathe of women. Women who feel themselves so ordinary that they have not only become invisible to society, but to themselves, with neither their abilities nor their voices being perceived to have any value. Maybe I speak for a whole tribe of the unseen and unheard. When you embark on the sort of discovery process I've been on over the past few years, there's a sort of sifting through of your life, looking for the dots and connections, the themes and influences that have informed the decisions you've made. And I've come to see that none of them are inherently good or bad. They just are. They're all perfect, as without them, my life wouldn't have uniquely qualified me for what I'm now planning to do with Panning for Gold. In some ways, I see myself as a member of a sandwich generation. I'm not using the term in the way it's generally used, which speaks of the women who had their children later in life and ended up caring for both kids and parents simultaneously. I'm talking about a generation sandwiched between old notions and beliefs around what it is to be a good daughter, wife and mother, and the new, more modern ideas of personal power and freedom. I was born in London smack in the middle of the 60s, a time sandwiched between the birth of the feminist movement and the last gasps of the traditional forms of womanhood. Looking back, I think my life has been one long attempt to shake off the latter and embrace the former. I was born to a stay-at-home mother and a workaholic father. My childhood was comfortable, and I lacked for nothing, but it was tinged with a running theme of absences. The absence of a father's presence, the absence of the model of a loving and equal marriage between my parents, the absence of a happy and fulfilled mother. My mother is Norwegian and moved to the UK when she married my dad, and looking back, I can see she was deeply unhappy, getting little support from my dad, with no friends or family as backup. And finally, the absence of success at school. I was very much a late bloomer, and academic success in those days was really the only thing that seemed to matter. So for years, I saw myself as unintelligent, and that is something that stuck. During my teenage years, I became more and more present to the imbalance of power in my parents' relationship. My dad was the sole breadwinner and would often say things like, "I earn the pennies," which meant that what he wanted went, and we sort of accepted that. My mother got a monthly housekeeping allowance with which to buy food and clothes, etc., which I think was fairly typical back then, but I see it as so infantilizing from where I stand now, and it made me quite annoyed at the time. He was often quite dismissive of my mother's intelligence when she was actually a high achiever at school and had wanted to become a teacher. In fact, she would later embark on and get a degree in her 40s after I left home for university. I think the thing that I only really sensed when I was younger, but understood more fully when I was older, was that my mother didn't really have a voice, and as a result, she shrank herself and silenced herself. Leaving the marriage didn't feel like an option to her, I think. The loss of financial support and the way society looked at divorce in those days would have been enough to make her think twice. As a result, there was a palpable undercurrent of unhappiness in her for many, many years, which she did her best to tampen down. All this makes my father out to be a bit of a monster, which is actually the furthest thing from the truth. He is really a very loving man. When he was at home, he made us feel very loved. He was a hugger and affectionate in a way that my mother really wasn't. He is deeply loyal and will do anything for those he loves. I realise now that people in life can be paradoxical. The man I observed was both an absent and unsupportive husband, but also a loving father. Similarly, my mother was physically present, took care of our needs, but felt emotionally absent for much of the time. Ultimately, by the end of my teenage years, there was one thing I was adamant about. There was no way I would end up becoming a housewife like my mother. I was very judgmental about her in the way that the young are. I saw her as weak and dependent, and I told myself there was no way I was going to put myself in that position. I had finally found my stride academically, literally in the last 2 years of school, and found I was actually pretty good at English and history, but finally chose to study history with a subsidiary in history of art and got into a good university, though I never really shook off the doubt about whether I actually had any real ability. I was, however, clear that I was going to have a career. I even had a picture of the Porsche I was going to buy on my pinboard when I studied for my final exams as motivation. When I left university, I embarked on a job in marketing and PR in the heady days, the late 80s, when champagne flowed and perks such as a company car were readily available. So my choices once I got married 4 years later seem inexplicable to me now when I look back, but I can see that my earlier life experiences set me up to expect less than and to accept less than. About a year after getting married, I had my son. At the time, I was working in the marketing department of one of the big 4 law firms in London. It was a high-pressure environment where anyone working less than a 12-hour day was dismissively referred to as a part-timer, and people literally were expected to sell their souls to the behemoth that was the firm. Whilst on maternity leave, I managed to negotiate a part-time position to return to, which was of itself quite radical then. Flexible working wasn't really mainstream yet, and that was the problem. I could see with a sinking heart that it would probably be expected to do a 5-day week in 3 days, and I just couldn't see it working. I sat down with my husband, I'll call him Joe, and did some rough numbers. By the time we'd paid for daycare and train fares, etc., my income would be all but swallowed up. Plus, I was overwhelmingly in love with this little being I'd just given birth to and didn't really want to be parted from him. I had to make the decision whether to go back or not quite early on, I think within 8 or 10 weeks of having him, and I wonder whether if I'd had a bit more time for the reality of motherhood to bite, I'd have made the same decision. But at the time, I convinced myself it was the right decision not to go back, and I became a full-time mother. I had my second child, a daughter, 2 years later, and then my third, another daughter, 3 years after that. Suddenly, I had 3 children under 5 and had fallen into a pattern of behaviour that had been modelled by my parents. Joe went to work. I took care of everything at home. Joe would usually be back well after 7, when the kids would have been fed, bathed and put to bed, and the expectation was that dinner would be ready for him in a tidy house. And I went along with it. My childhood patterning set me up to believe that was exactly what I should be doing, that was the deal I had made by not going back to work. But of course somewhere, deep below the surface, the younger feminist me, the one who wasn't going to be my mother, chafed against it, wondered how on earth I'd got myself in that place. But Joe would tell me how lucky I was not to be working, that he envied me and that he'd swap places with me in a heartbeat, secure in the knowledge that that could never happen, as he had earned way more than I could, particularly once I'd been out of the workforce for over 5 years. Ultimately, he made me doubt myself, to question whether what I felt was valid. Joe was a very strong character, 10 years older than me and highly intelligent. He loved to debate. At least that's what he called it. It often felt more of a harangue than anything else. He genuinely believed he was the smartest person in any given room and would often take the position that others needed convincing of the right course of action, which of course would be his, and he would literally wear them down to accept it. And so began a long period of what I now see was a kind of low-key gaslighting, so that I doubted and second-guessed my feelings and the deepening unease over so many aspects of my life and marriage. And of course I see now that the dynamic that my parents had modelled during my childhood set me up to accept this. Joe and I met when I was really quite young, 22, and I hadn't yet had a chance to grow into myself, to get clear about what I stood for and where my worth lay. I was pretty impressionable, and coupled with a long history of low self-confidence, I was easily persuaded that I was probably wrong. By the time I started going to mother and toddler groups with my youngest, Joe and I had settled into a pretty unhappy dynamic where we each thought the other had it easy. At those groups, I found myself talking to mothers there and found so many other women in the same boat. Intelligent, articulate women who had given up their careers in law or accountancy, marketing or events, often because there really was only room for one person to give their all to their career in those days whilst having a family. And as they held the fort at home, their husbands' careers soared. I was struck by the waste of all this talent and wished there was a way for these women to be able to work in a way that was compatible with having a family. I even toyed with setting up an agency, matching local businesses who were unable to afford full-time professional help with mothers who wanted to work part-time. Meanwhile, in my spare time, I had by then renovated and styled 2 properties and was about to move on to a third. I found I had a bit of a talent for interiors, so when Katie started nursery school, I enrolled in an interior design course which I loved. After completing my third renovation a few years later, I started my own interior design business and the work flowed in. I ran my business from home, around the family of course, and actually did pretty well. However, Joe had convinced me it was just a small thing on the side, not very important, and it should definitely not come before family and husband. The house was still expected to be tidy and dinner ready when he got home. Fast forward to 2007 when we did a house swap to South Africa. It was such a beautiful country. We marvelled at the incredibly cheap real estate and fantasised briefly about moving there and being mortgage-free. The idea grew. I think I hoped that without the pressure of work and being the sole breadwinner, Joe might go back to being the laid-back Aussie I thought I'd met and fallen in love with. So at the beginning of 2008, a couple of months before the GFC hit, we sold our house with a view to moving overseas, where Joe would ditch his IT career in favour of running a deli and cafe, which was his long-held dream. South Africa didn't really feel like a safe option, and after prolonged discussions where we tossed around ideas from Sardinia and Croatia to Paraguay, we finally agreed to move to Australia. It seemed an obvious and practical choice given that Joe and the children all had Australian citizenship, even though Joe was initially reluctant to return to his home country. And that is what we did. We arrived in Australia at the end of 2009. We'd initially thought we'd move to Newcastle after having done some online research, which indicated that house prices were quite reasonable and it seemed like a thriving city which was going places. However, we decided not to make the final decision until we'd had a chance to visit it. That and another couple of places on our shortlist. So after flying into Melbourne, where Joe's family lived, we drove up the coast via a couple of different places along the way, one of which was Avalon on the northern beaches. We instantly fell in love with the area, even though Joe had said he didn't want to settle in Sydney. Old Melbourne-Sydney rivalries coming to the fore, I think, so we pressed on up the coast to Newcastle. Within a couple of hours of arriving, though, we both knew it wasn't the place for us, and we agreed we'd head back to the northern beaches to look for somewhere to live. It was to prove to be a fateful decision. Initially, life was great. Joe awarded himself a sabbatical year, buoyed by the great price we'd got when selling our house in the UK at just the right time. We found a lovely rental in Clareville and made friends amongst our neighbours and enjoyed the beautiful lifestyle. Before long, however, it became clear that the rents and cost of living were much higher in Sydney than Newcastle, and that running a deli cafe wasn't going to cut it income-wise. Joe started to have second thoughts when he realised how many coffees he'd have to sell to make the same sort of money as his work in IT. However, he couldn't find an IT job in Sydney. He had very niche experience from the UK and no contacts here after 20 years away, and kept hitting a wall. Meanwhile, he'd become increasingly disillusioned with the Australia he had returned to. He felt it had turned into a total nanny state and missed his life in Europe. The kids and I, on the other hand, loved our new life, and the children, who were by then 14, 12 and 9, were settled in their new schools. So Joe suggested that I stay with the kids and that he should go back to the UK for a 6-month contract to freshen up his CV, just as a temporary measure. That 6-month contract led to another, and another, and another, and before I knew it, I became a single parent for the next 9 years. However, I got on with my life. I started art classes, joined book clubs, made friends, and we bought a property with the intention of renovating it. In the end, it became a full knockdown and rebuild, which I designed and project managed. Once the build was finished, I started working with Fiona Pearman, a neighbour and friend, in her boutique brand agency, Brand Illumination. I'd come full circle back to my marketing roots. I found I loved using my brain in a different way to the way I had in my interior design. We specialised in brand discovery work, which entailed going into organisations and conducting focus groups and interviews with key stakeholders and investigating whether they were fulfilling their brand promise. I discovered that I was good at seeing and listening for the gaps. It was in the unsaid and the previously unseen where the really good intelligence lay. Over those 9 years, it became increasingly clear to me that my marriage with Joe was in real trouble. In addition to his very strong personality, he also had a tendency to a very short fuse. And during the earlier phase of our marriage, I had, like the frog in the slowly warming pot of water, grown accustomed to his increasingly difficult behaviour and would model my mother's appeasing ways, doing my best to keep the powder keg from going off. However, once he was out of our lives on a daily basis, the kids and I found his short visits home twice a year increasingly harder and harder. Suddenly, we were like the frog thrown into the boiling water, and none of us liked it. The children started finding friends' houses to go to whilst he was back and made themselves scarce. Meanwhile, I'd made some amazing friends, particularly Fiona, who had encouraged me to see something more in myself and who had gently nudged me towards a little self-exploration and self-development. I was beginning to grow and develop more clarity over the sort of life I wanted to lead and the way I wanted to feel. I realised I'd been making myself small for years, squashing my feelings into a little box and not trusting my intuition. I started to see that I had compromised myself over and over again. Finally, things came to a head during COVID, when Joe came back to Australia for 6 months. I felt this was the perfect time for him to work on his temper, not just for me, but the kids too, and for us to work on our marriage. Meanwhile, my youngest was increasingly holding up a mirror to me and holding me accountable, asking me whether I was really willing to accept this behaviour and unhappy marriage, literally begging me to leave him. We tried to do some counselling, but after the first session, Joe said he wasn't willing to open the Pandora's box that would be required, even if it meant the end of our marriage. I knew in that moment that it was over. I couldn't stay married to him if things were never going to improve. We agreed to separate, and it was all quite calm. Even though it was clear that Joe didn't really want the marriage to end, I think on some level we both knew that we hadn't been happy for a long time. We had stayed in longer than perhaps we should have, ultimately because of what our parents had modelled, and whilst my parents have found a contentment and happiness in their later years, Joe's parents had also stayed together, in their case deeply unhappily, all their lives. So in a way we both thought that a level of unhappiness was normal and acceptable. However, I had found a crystal clarity. I did not want to model that dynamic for my children anymore. There was no way I wanted my girls to have what I'd put up with, and of course I was acutely conscious that my youngest was watching my every move. I also didn't want my son to think that what he'd witnessed was okay either. I wanted to break that pattern. So after 26 years of marriage and 32 years together, we separated. Once the house was sold, the mortgage paid off, and the money divided in two, I would be left with just enough to buy a small house. But it was clear that I would need to get a proper job, by which I mean one with a regular income, as I no longer had the safety net of a partner with a regular income to cover the inevitable gaps when freelancing. But the big question was, as what and how? It was daunting. I was in my mid-50s. I hadn't worked in the corporate world for 25 years. My CV was full of holes. I remember sitting down to write one and wondering how on earth I would be able to get a job. Who would want to give a job to someone with a resume like mine, I thought. being a full-time mother for 8 years, followed by running my interior design business, followed by moving halfway across the world and building a house, followed by working freelance at a brand agency, it all looked so piecemeal and insubstantial. I felt inadequate and exposed. I remember Joe saying that perhaps I shouldn't be fussy and to take a job at Bunnings or Woolies, and there was a time when I might have agreed. But by then I'd grown enough that a stubborn part of me refused to accept that that was all I could aim for. Somewhere down deep inside, I knew that I had something worthwhile to offer employers if I could just market myself in the way that I had companies over the years. I needed to look for the unique selling points and tell a compelling story. I looked back over my life and found there were consistent themes or threads. I was highly creative. My marketing days, my long-running love of art, and my time as an interior designer all pointed to that. And I was insightful, good at reading between the lines. When I looked back at my time as an interior designer, I recognised that I'd been good at deciphering what it was that people actually wanted as opposed to what they'd said they'd wanted. This was further developed during my time working with Fiona at Brand Illumination, where I'd really come to understand in a much more concrete way the strength of my insight. She had encouraged me to follow my instincts and to dive into the gaps. I also knew I was good at listening. All those focus groups and interviews had shown me that, and that I was good at joining the dots, at seeing the threads of what was going on, and at distilling it all into reports which made sense to our clients. I had developed my writing skills, my love of English had come flooding back, and I knew that I was good at telling a story. And finally, I reflected on the renovations I had done, the design, the problem-solving, the logistics, the people managing. These were all strong skills which could be applied in other contexts. So I wrote the most compelling CV I could, focusing on the skills I would be bringing, hoping it would distract from the patchy chronological work experience section of the resume. And when I saw a job advertised for a bid advisor in an engineering firm, I applied, even though I had never done bid advisory work before and had never worked in engineering before. But the job description mentioned facilitating discussions around wind themes and editing and polishing bid documents, and I could see that all that I had done up until that point would actually allow me to do that my skills might be transferable and adapted to the role. Conducting my own discovery process and getting clear on where my value lay was what enabled me to go into the interview with a clear sense of how I could do the role and what I would be bringing to the table. The deep inner knowing, the new inner confidence that created is really what got me the job. And if this were a movie, that's where it would end. The girl gets the job, is wildly successful, lives happily ever after. But life rarely ties up in a nice little bow. Somewhere in the middle of this process, I had met someone new, and to my astonishment, fallen in love. Hook, line, and sinker. All tracking for the movie ending, you'd be right in thinking. Except, he ended it, abruptly, and I was plunged into a state of complete and utter despair. The breakup happened to coincide with all that rain last year, and the weather perfectly matched my mood. I was brought low, lower than low. All that newfound self-confidence evaporated overnight. For a month or so, I wallowed. I was a picture of abject misery. I kept asking myself why, what was wrong with me. I thought I'd found a second chance at love, and it had been taken away from me. It felt brutal and made me wonder whether I was inherently unlovable. I couldn't see a path forward. Finally, the gorgeous Fiona said to me I would continue to feel at the mercy of life's events until I learned to love myself. I remember being completely flabbergasted by that comment. It seemed so flip, so insubstantial. Plus, I didn't know what the hell it meant. I went home and Googled how to love yourself. And so began what I now call my dark night of the soul, a deep dive into all the parts of me that I had either glossed over, ignored, or had never dug into. It was big, and it's what led me to Giselle and the wonderful Catalyst Group. Those guys helped me to reconnect and rediscover myself, to really deepen my understanding of the value I bring to the world, which I came to see had been fairly superficial before. In the process, I became familiar with the principle of authenticity is profitable, and for the first time I had to consider when I was most authentically myself. I thought it might mean a return to interior design. I knew that I had loved my work as a designer, and I toyed with the idea of creating homes using low-tox materials which nurtured both physically and aesthetically. I called them healing heart spaces. But I came to realise it was less about the design process, the furniture and the fabrics, and more about connecting with that intuitive knowing of what people needed rather than wanted, that I was my best self. I remembered that when I'd worked with Fiona at Brand Illumination, it had been the moments when I'd had insights or flashes of intuition during conversations which led our inquiry down a different path where I had most excelled. Over the months, during the Catalyst group calls, I started to feel compelled to say things to people, to offer my view, and to my surprise, they were well received, even sought after. This crystallised at a retreat I attended when I finally leaned in to sharing my observations without self-censoring in the belief that I couldn't possibly have anything of value to say. Astonishingly, the people there actively vocalised their belief that they valued my opinions. I remember one of the participants saying that I'd just delivered another drop the mic moment. I was stunned, but it was there that I finally realised that my superpower was my intuitive insight. At that retreat, I shared my vision for the Healing Heart Spaces, and 2 attendees approached me afterwards saying they would like to explore working with me. One was a lawyer who could see an application for my idea for people setting up new homes post-divorce. Another was an architect who loved the idea of doing a discovery process to help in a project she was working on for some Sudanese refugees. It was the latter project which helped me to hone in more closely to my ultimate mission. The Sudanese refugees we spent the day with had arrived in the country with nothing. After a few years, once they had got established, their first thought had been to help other refugees arriving, many with complex disabilities. Deeply ingrained in their culture is that all are one family. The principle that it takes a village to raise a child is not just a concept in Sudan, it's a lived experience. These refugees had applied for a grant to buy and adapt a home for their disabled countrymen. They were awarded $4,000. However, rather than be downhearted, they vowed to do the very best they could with the money and kept impeccable records. The following year, they applied again and were next time awarded $40,000. This went on until they had finally demonstrated that they could be trusted and given large enough sums to fulfill their ambition of buying a property which they could convert. Over the next few years, they acquired a number of properties around Melbourne. The scale and breadth of their vision humbled me. It made me consider, who are my people? Who should I be extending my hand back to and helping up? And I realised it was women in their 50s, women like me, and the women in the mother and toddler groups I'd chatted to all those years ago, but who had been less lucky, less fortunate. I started to consider how I could help the legions of women over 50 who end up sleeping in their cars or worse on the streets. I was shocked to learn they are Australia's fastest growing cohort of homeless people. My vision is big, too big really. It ultimately includes villages of affordable housing in the form of eco-pods or similar. The marriage of my earlier idea of healthy heart-centered homes and helping my tribe. But it begins with Panning for Gold, because I see it as an early intervention piece, helping women coming out of relationships to get established with fulfilling careers which mean they won't face homelessness in old age in any form. So I created Panning for Gold, an 8-week program, a process of self-rediscovery. It's designed to help women who have taken extensive career breaks to sift back through their past to find the tiny pieces of gold in their lives, the skills, experiences and attributes which they might have dismissed as not having any value, and joining them together to create a stronger whole and more compelling story. It's a distillation of all the learnings I've had over the last few years. Its main focus is on helping women to go back out into the workforce post-separation or divorce, or even after the kids have left home, to secure the sorts of jobs where they can thrive. But it's a bit more than that. It's the first step in what I hope will be a powerful alteration in the way women see themselves, because what I have learnt is that you have to own and fully embody your worth deep in your core in order to live the life you're supposed to live. As I said earlier, my vision is big, because ultimately my mission is to create a community of women who, by seeing and acknowledging their value and worth, step into their power and then use that power to reach back and help others to do the same. When women of a certain age really fully understand their value, they are a force to be reckoned with. My vision is the creation of an army of powerful warriors for change. So that's my story, how I arrived at this point. It's not exciting. It is, as I promised, very ordinary. But I'm hoping that something extraordinary can be born out of the ordinary. That I can play a tiny part in ensuring that all women, regardless of their past and current circumstances, get the opportunity to flourish and thrive, and together we can create a fairer and more equal society.
Hey guys, if you love this podcast, I have 2 requests. Number 1, sign up to the newsletter, which you can find in the show notes. Sharing is one of my superpowers, and there is only so much that I can share through the medium of podcasting. And I have very big plans this year to be radically generous to you. So sign up to that newsletter where you will be able to receive a whole lot more that I trust will be super valuable to you. And number 2, I'm a massive referrer of the people I love to the people I love. Please share this episode or podcast with the people you love, and let's create some more breathtaking ripples of impact.